Hello and how you doing, folks? Yours truly, Randy Rand here with another version of randyrand.com. Thank you for tuning in. Today we spoke with Amy Traub. She is the Associate Director for Policy and Research at Demos. And Amy co-authored the study, The Asset Value of Whiteness, Understanding the Racial Wealth Gap. It's a phenomenal study. It was done some time ago, but uh, I decided to add it to this documentary as I found the information pertinent to what we're talking about. Um, in the interview, simply put, we talked about the generational wealth gap and how it's rooted in public policy. We also talked about the importance of wealth being handed down through generations. And one thing that really spoke out to me and that's really affected me, we talked about uh, how racial injustices are carried forward as wealth handed down across generations and reinforced by colorblind practices and policies. We also talked about uh, how wealth is handed down through families, and white families pretty much do this, which is one of the ways that they hold on to their wealth, which is a great thing. I would totally recommend it, but uh, and certainly not to say that all black families do this, but we don't hand down wealth. And in many instances, the minute we find wealth, we spend it. And, it's for short-term gain without thinking about the long-term effects. And we talked a little bit about that in the interview. We also talked about the detrimental effects on public policies on black families, such as redlining, which really stands out to me, which, according to her, hasn't really been practiced for a while now, but still, it's a public policy and it was legal, it was law. And much of the policies that affect us in the African American community in a negative way are law. They're policies. And we discussed that as well. I certainly hope you enjoy the interview. It's a much needed listen to. And hopefully we'll be able to bring you more information like this down the road. And thanks for the time. Today we are talking to Amy Traub, and she's a co-author of the study, The Asset Value of Whiteness, Understanding the Racial Wealth Gap. And how you doing today, Amy?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Very good, thank you. And just want to remind our audience that you are the Associate Director for Policy Research at Demos and co-author of the very study that I just mentioned, and that you've testified before the United States House of Representatives and the United States Senate on issues relating to job quality and the middle class, and that you've contributed essays and opinion articles to a variety of publications, including The Nation, the New York Times, Newsday, Spotlight on Poverty and Opportunity, as well as the Atlanta Journal-Constitution and the San Jose Mercury News. And my first question is your study the first of its kind to yield or produce these powerful results?
Yeah, so I'm really glad you asked that because it gives me a chance to talk about some of the other really excellent research that's being done on the racial wealth gap.
Mm-hmm.
So I want to recognize my co-authors on this study at the Institute on Assets and Social Policy at Brandeis University. And listeners who are interested in learning more about the racial wealth gap should look for a new book. It's out, I think, next week or in a few weeks,
Mm-hmm.
called Toxic Inequality, and that's by my co-author on this study, Tom Shapiro. So I think folks could pre-order it now. The title is Toxic Inequality, and it's just a really powerful and compelling look at the racial wealth gap, both in terms of policy and then also in terms of real people's lives, which is something we can't capture in just a research paper. And then I would say that some other great work that's being done on the topic of the racial wealth gap is being done by Diedrich Asante Muhammad at
Mm-hmm.
CFED, scholars at the Center for Global Policy Solutions and the Insight Center for Community Economic Development, and by academic researchers. There is a lot of wonderful work out there that needs more attention.
Now, in the article, it says, and I'm quoting, the educational and wealth building opportunities directly denied to people of color in past generations continue to reverberate in the lives of their children, even those whose educational achievements open up opportunities for well paid employment opportunities, end quote. So, is it safe to say that as opportunities present themselves or are passed down to white people all throughout their generations, black people have had misery, failure, and barely any opportunities all throughout their generation?
Well, I think the idea of generations is really key here because it's impressive to see what people of color and households of color have accomplished in spite of limitations on opportunity. But I think that the idea of generations really is critical to our findings here on wealth because wealth is handed down across generations and it grows across generations.
Mm-hmm.
So what individuals do in their lifetime, it can make a difference, but it's not enough for the typical household to close this gap in wealth that really is rooted in policies like redlining that enabled white families to get mortgages and buy homes in the post-World War II era and barred African American families from doing the same thing. Now, that was one or two generations ago, depending on your age, on all of our ages.
Mm-hmm.
But because wealth is passed down like this, it impacts the size of our bank accounts today and how likely we are to own homes or have other really valuable assets.
I agree that many public policies need to be changed in order to make positive changes for and in Black America. Please speak to the detrimental effects of policies such as redlining, mass incarceration, predatory finance, zoning laws, racial disparities in wages and benefits, as well as risk-based pricing.
Yeah, well, that you have highlighted a whole lot of policy right there.
Mm-hmm.
Those are just many different ways. Something like redlining that was really a matter of just blatantly discriminatory law for a long time, no longer written into the law in that way, although housing discrimination and segregation persist. Those policies are so important because of the fact that most Americans, black and white and Latino and Asian, most of our wealth for the typical household is in our homes and home ownership. And the divide between who owns a home and who doesn't is very key, how valuable that home is. The ability to be paying down on a mortgage rather than paying rent each month and continuing to accrue more value and more wealth in your home that then can be passed on to a future generation. Maybe they sell the home, but then they have that money to start a business. Maybe you take out a second mortgage and are able to send a child to college without them having to take on a tremendous amount of debt. Um, so policies around home ownership and around tax policy are key. Mass incarceration is key because, I mean, it's hard to even say it because it seems so obvious. If somebody is locked up and in communities of color that are disproportionately affected by mass incarceration, you are not accruing wealth, and your family is spending money trying to maintain contact, visit you, make very expensive prison phone calls. That drains wealth in so many ways.
Well,
I could talk maybe a bit more about tax policy. That's one where it's just very clear what the impact is.
and hopefully you can come back onto the show and discuss the tax policy piece because that's very important as well. If you could please speak about the importance of social networks and how white people use them to build wealth.
The data on this is really that everyone uses social networks.
Mm-hmm.
We all, you're looking, there's an opening at the place where you work, whatever that place is. You've got a cousin or a friend who's looking for a job. You think they do a good job, you recommend them. The difference is that because white workers are more likely to already be occupying I don't know if I want to say better jobs, higher
Mm-hmm.
paying jobs,
Mm-hmm.
more central industries.
Okay.
When they are able to use their social networks, they are able to enable friends and family who, because we lead such segregated lives in this country, not all of us, but so many of us, um, those jobs that are attained through social networks disproportionately go to other white people, and those good jobs then are disproportionately continue to be in that community.
Okay, now could you please talk about the effect that poverty has on minority families that are struggling to not only make their ends meet, but are trying to provide superior educational opportunities for the advancement of their children?
Well, absolutely, and that's a thorny issue that has a lot of different parts to it.
Mm-hmm.
One part we can think about that I've looked at more, and my colleague at Demos has looked at, is has to do with higher education, so with college, and there are many issues with K through 12 education as well. But one issue that does not get discussed a lot is that there is really deep racial inequality in student debt. 81% of black college graduates leave school with student debt, compared to less than two-thirds of white college graduates. And so this is despite the fact that black students have lower graduation rates, and in fact taking on so much debt can actually encourage people to leave school. So this is another effect of wealth. Then, if a household has the wealth to send a student to college, that is without the student having to take on debt, it increases their chances of graduation. It increases their ability to go into their working lives then with a degree and not having to pay off that burden of debt. And that's just another way, much as we'd like to see higher education as an opportunity for mobility, the fact that it's so expensive means that households that already have wealth, which are disproportionately white households, really are at an advantage when it comes to higher education compared to households that don't have wealth, which also includes many white households, but disproportionately households of color.
We are speaking to Amy Traub, who's the co-author of the study that just recently came out. It's called The Asset Value of Whiteness, Understanding the Racial Wealth Gap. Amy is the Associate Director for Policy and Research at Demos. And as I mentioned, she's the co-author of the study. She's testified before the U.S. House of Representatives and the United States Senate on issues relating to job quality and middle class. She's also contributed essays and opinion articles to a variety of publications, including The Nation, The New York Times, Newsday, Spotlight on Poverty and Opportunity, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and the San Jose Mercury News. And she's so kind to give us some of her very valuable time today. Amy, I wanted to ask you if you could please talk about how it can help address the problem of racial wealth inequality.
So the racial wealth audit is a new framework and tool that Demos and our partners at the Institute on Assets and Social Policy developed, and it can be used to assess policies on disparities in wealth by race. The idea is that we need to assess the potential impacts of proposed policies and current policies on the racial wealth gap to be sure that the policies don't increase the wealth gap. And, ideally we have policies that are aimed at decreasing the wealth gap. We want to know how much is it likely to increase or decrease the wealth gap. And so I encourage listeners to take a look at our new website, which is racialwealthaudit.org, for more information on the racial wealth audit. And this most recent report is one that comes out of a series of reports looking at the racial wealth gap, and applying the tools of the audit to assessing policy.
Okay, now you are recommending a policy fix to remedy the racial wealth inequality. What types of policies would you suggest be implemented to make this happen?
Yeah, so I mentioned tax policy earlier, and that's certainly not the only place we can look, but that is definitely one way, because we have tax policies in this country that primarily benefit households that already have some wealth at the expense of households that don't have wealth, and that widens the racial wealth gap. So one thing we certainly should do is shift our tax policies to reward work and effort rather than existing wealth. So, for example, right now we tax income from capital gains, and that's investment income, at a lower rate than wages earned at work. And changing that tax structure so that the tax benefits go to the wages from work rather than this kind of passive capital gains income would help low wealth households, which again are disproportionately people of color. So that doesn't address everything. That's one policy that would help to rebalance our tax system and could have a really good impact in terms of closing the racial wealth gap.
You mentioned earlier about black students borrow money for college at much higher rates and in higher amounts to receive the very same degrees as their white counterparts. Could you speak a little more about that?
Okay, well, sure. We know that a college education can be a ladder of social mobility. Um, Households that earn a bachelor's degree or get some other kind of college certification, they're more likely to be employed. They generally have higher earning power than high school graduates and dropouts. And they can use their higher incomes then to build savings and wealth. And we do see all of that. So I think some people may have read or heard about our research and taken away from that and said going to college isn't worth it, particularly for black students. That is definitely not what we found and not the message we want to say. The issue is that wealth also plays a role in determining who attends college in the first place and how much debt students have to take on to get a degree.
Mm-hmm.
So it's generating a kind of wealth feedback loop as the parents' level of education and wealth really predicts the level of education their children will complete and the amount that children have to borrow to go to college in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's what we're seeing.
We have been speaking to Amy Traub. She's the co-author of the study, The Asset Value of Whiteness, Understanding the Racial Wealth Gap. She's the Associate Director for Policy Research at Demos, and she's also, like I mentioned, the co-author of the study. She's testified before the United States House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate on issues relating to job quality and the middle class. And she has contributed essays and opinion articles to a variety of publications, including The Nation, the New York Times, Newsday, Light on Poverty and Opportunity, the Atlanta Journal-Constitution, and the San Jose Mercury News. And she's so very kind to give us some of her very valuable time today. And in closing, Amy, please feel free to plug your website or any other projects that you may be involved in.
Oh, well, thank you so much. I would again urge your listeners to look at racialwealthaudit.org for more information specifically about the racial wealth gap. My organization is Demos. You can find us online at demos.org, and we have a really broad set of policies that we look at Demos. We are focused on building an America where everyone has an equal say in our democracy and an equal chance in our economy. And this work on the racial wealth gap is just a part of trying to address inequality in our democracy and in our economy.
Now, you mentioned the new book that's coming out by one of your coworkers, Toxic Inequality.
Yes. Listeners definitely should check that out. The author is Tom Shapiro. It is out this month, and I believe it's available for pre-order.
Amy, we thank you so very much for giving us some of your very valuable time today, and certainly would love to have you come back onto the show, as this is a topic that can't be covered in as little as 30 minutes or so, but certainly would like to follow you in the work that you do, as well as your co-workers as well. We thank you for giving us some of your time today, Amy. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All
Good
right.
afternoon.
And you the same.